It's my pleasure tonight briefly to say something about the Dudleian lectures and then to ask my colleague, Professor Anne Brody, to introduce this year's lecturer. Our distinguished speaker this evening is Dr. Suzanne Harjo, poet, writer, tireless advocate for Native American rights. Over 5 decades of quite remarkable dedication, Suzanne has helped develop key laws to promote and protect Native nations and their arts, cultures, and languages, including the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the National Museum of the American Indian Act, and the Native American Graves Protections and Repatriation Act. The title of this evening's lecture is Rescuing Religion from Civilization, Cultural Loss and Reclamation in Native America. And we'll hear much more about our speaker on tonight's topic in just a moment. Please allow me to say just a little about the oldest and most distinguished endowed lecture at Harvard, the Dudleian Lecture. It was established in 1751 and named after Paul Dudley, who was born in 1675 in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and died in 1751. After graduating from Roxbury Latin and then from Harvard in 1690, he studied law at the Temple in London and became Attorney General of Massachusetts and later Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court from 1745 until his death in 1751. Paul Dudley is the founder of the Dudleian Lectures on Religion here at the Harvard Divinity School. The topics of the lecture vary from year to year, and this year's theme is natural religion. Previous lecturers include Ranald Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. More recent speakers include Pilar Aquino, Sally McFaig, Scott Appleby, and last year, Sister Mary Hughes, former president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Tonight, my colleague, Anne Brody, senior lecturer in American Religious History and director of the Women's Studies and Religion program here at Harvard, will introduce our speaker. Professor Brody has led and organized a lecture series on Native American religions in connections with her class this semester, and tonight's presentation is another event within that terrific lecture series. As many of you know, Anne's primary interest is the religious history of American women. Her first book, Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America, explores the engagement between the women's right movement and the religious movement focused on contact with spirits of the dead. She also has an interest in the issues surrounding the study of Native American religions and is engaged in an ongoing research project concerning a Cheyenne child taken captive at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. She has published many articles on women in Judaism, Christian Science, and American religious life. She edited Transforming the Faith of Our Fathers, The Women Who Changed American Religion, the result of a historic conference that brought 25 pioneers of religious feminism together at HDS. In 2005, she inaugurated the school's year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of the admission of women to HDS with a convocation address entitled A Short Half Century, 50 Years of Women at Harvard Divinity School. So it's my pleasure to invite my colleague, good friend, Anne Brody to the podium to introduce tonight's very distinguished speaker. Anne, thank you.
Well, thank you, David, for that utterly unnecessary and unmerited introduction. I feel now as if I have to double the length of my introduction of our distinguished speaker, but you'll be relieved to hear that I won't. But it is indeed a very great pleasure to introduce Suzanne Harjo and to welcome her to Harvard Divinity School. As I've had a chance to read Suzanne's work with my class during the term and to see her in action today, I've come to appreciate the qualities that have enabled her to become one of the key architects of Native American rights legislation over the last 5 decades. She has pushed from the outside and pulled from the inside, moving back and forth between Indian rights organizations and federal agencies, between art galleries and courts of law, between gatherings of indigenous elders and congressional caucuses, between ceremonial grounds and sports arenas, always open to allies wherever she might find them. This has enabled her to seek the most effective avenues to promote and protect Native nations, Native sovereignty, Native children, Native arts, cultures, languages, religious freedom, and repatriation. Her holistic and many-faceted career is a great challenge for an introducer. Difficult to summarize, often proceeding on more than one front at a time. So I will only offer a few highlights. Dr. Harjo is the past executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, as well as the former legislative liaison of the Native American Rights Fund. And she currently serves as president of the Morning Star Institute, a national Native rights organization founded in 1984 for traditional and cultural advocacy, arts promotion, and research. Inside the federal government, Dr. Harjo served in many capacities, including special assistant for Indian legislation in the Carter administration, and as the principal author of the 1979 President's Report to Congress on American Indian Religious Freedom. She was a key player in authoring the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, as David mentioned, the Indian Child Welfare Act of the same year, as well as a seemingly endless list of laws and reports concerning federal responsibilities for Native languages, arts, and education. Dr. Harjo is one of 7 Native people who filed the 1992 landmark case, Harjo et al. Versus Pro Football Inc., against the disparaging name of the Washington football team, and she continues to be involved with ongoing litigation with that entity. She has worked tirelessly to transform American museums from agents of colonialism into arenas for the promotion of Native American rights and cultures, both through legislation and as a curator and author of curatorial essays. Her family's own experience with museums became the basis for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which dramatically transformed Harvard's own Peabody Museum, as well as for the legislation governing the human remains and cultural patrimony of Native Americans in the possession of the federal government, the National Museum of the American Indian Act. I will mention only in passing Ms. Harjo's extensive accomplishments in radio and film, her work as an award-winning columnist, her own creative work as a poet, and her many other publications, because I know you came here to hear her speak, not me. Suffice it to say that for those of us concerned with the inadequacy of Enlightenment definitions of religion that segment off inherently connected aspects of reality, Dr. Harjo's life and work are a case in point. Please welcome the Dudleian Lecturer for 2014, Suzanne Schoen Harjo.
Thanks so much. Well, now we can all retire or die. Thank you for that great send-off. I'm Suzanne Schoen Harjo, and I'm a mother and grandmother, and those things are really first and foremost with me. I'm Cheyenne and Hodulgee Muscogee. I'm a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, and was raised also culturally at Nuyaka tribal grounds, for those of you who know Muscogee things, and have 2 parents. My mother was Cheyenne, and my dad was Muscogee. And they influenced me greatly, as did their parents who helped raise me, as did my mother's uncle, my mother's brother, my uncle, and his wonderful wife, who also helped raise me. So it does take a village. One thing that I was always told as I was being brought up was never trust what you read, and always say no, because you can retreat from no. You can never retreat from yes. Anytime you say yes, it will be written in stone. And they were talking about policies and policy making, and my family, in addition to later older National Congress of American Indians people, really were the ones who taught me about leadership and how to behave. Never to go into a meeting alone, always go in with a friend or a witness. And I had wonderful instructions from my Muscogee relative, Philip Deere, who was the kind of second in charge, the Yehola, the healer, at the Nuyaka tribal grounds, who would give me lessons like, in our treaty it says that the river's ours from bank to bank, and we thought they meant from bank of the river to the other side of the river, and what they meant was from bank of the river to the Bank of America. And that always really kept with me. And whenever I went into a negotiation, to understand what the double entendre might be, what might really be meant by this word or that word. And that's quite something to keep in mind as you're trying to construct federal law, because what you're really doing is trying to build a door that everyone can get through. And you find that it's not a conventional door. You have to add something here, you have to add something here, because all of the peoples who are trying to get through that door have very special issues involved with their, whether it's religious freedom or child welfare or whatever the law might be. There is a uniqueness within every Native nation below our agreement about how to construct things. So, for example, when we were doing the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the follow-on laws, the repatriation laws, we were keeping in mind what the Warm Springs Confederation people told us about their experience with the Army Corps of Engineers. That the Army Corps of Engineers had dug up people along the Columbia River, and they were watching this from the other side of the river at Warm Springs. And they said that they would take responsibility for the people and rebury them. And the Army Corps of Engineers said, no, you can't. You have no relationship to these people. They said they're on the other side of the river. You think that we wouldn't have known them and interacted with them and married them and buried them and helped them through life, and they us. The Army Corps of Engineers kept insisting that no, there's a separation. You're on this side of the river and they're on that side of the river. And it was just an absurd situation, but that's exactly the kind of situation that a number of Native nations found themselves in with respect to the Army Corps of Engineers and other agencies and private entities. So we had to do something about that when we were doing repatriation law, and that became something that's in the law called cultural affiliation, where you don't need to be the people, you just need to be affiliated in some way. And that way could be through language, through proximity, through geography, through traditional place, through any number of ways. But that is a really important part of the Native American Graves Protection Act. And I always think of it as the Warm Springs edition. And that's that part of the door that isn't square, that's over here, and comes from a particular place. Everything on our side of the repatriation laws relates to a particular people or a particular nation, a particular culture, a particular religion, and is something that was someone's priority at some point. And we did a lot of traveling. We had meeting after meeting after meeting, and met in ceremony, and because these are terrible things to discuss. I mean, our people were being held, as many of the Vietnam vets of the time were calling it, as prisoners of war in the museums and in the other repositories around the country. And many of our people saw what we were doing as an absolute imperative to get them released. And people had different emphasis. Sometimes people were concerned about the human remains, sometimes not so much about that, but about the living beings, the sacred objects that were missing from ceremony, but they had a place, and they needed to be put back in that place. And the people were anxious to welcome them home. And here's an example of something that I can talk about. Many of us have buffalo dances all over the northern and southern plains, and out into Pueblo country. Buffalo dances are a long-standing part of our life. So at one point, the buffalo were virtually gone, and no native person had really lived with the buffalo as our ancestors had. I mean, our immediate ancestors had, but we had not, and our parents had not. So, but we were still doing buffalo dances. And once the herd started returning and different native nations started rebuilding these herds on their tribal lands, and we were able to actually look at the buffalo and what they were doing, my thought was, oh, that's why we do this movement. That's why we do this thing in the dance, that because the buffalo do it. This was just people watching the buffalo and imitating them. And that was something I understood later. A lot of people thought that. And that's how it is with these sacred objects, with these living beings, or what some Native nations call our friends. It's that way that we know how they are. We know what they look like. We know what they sound like. We know how they're shaped. We know them when we see them. So our elders going into these museums aren't going in with a shopping list and saying, I'll take one of these and one of those and one of those. They're going in with a very particular idea about who that person is, who that friend is, who that living being is, what that sacred object is. So and often they can tell the museum people many things about that object. Now some people will not disclose any information about these beings, and they don't need to. There are people who want to know all the details of that, but people are forbidden by the very tenets of the religion not to disclose that kind of information. Then there's another reason for non-disclosure. For many years, for many generations, every Secretary of the Interior, when the Secretary of the Interior had immense power over all the public lands that have now, everything that now makes up the Forest Service and other agencies outside the Interior, used to be within the Interior. And the Secretary of Interior, just without any law, without a single law, you're supposed to have a law before you have regulations. The Secretary of the Interior issued regulations in the 1800s, in the 1880s, called civilization regulations. And they were part of the Court of Indian Offenses, but they were issued in a separate book called Civilization. And they were about how Native people would be for the next 50 years. They were the regulations that outlawed the Sundance and other so-called ceremonies. They banned everything from interfering with the progressive education of children, which meant as children were being taken off to federal Indian boarding school and stripped of their cultures, stripped of their everything, the way they looked, everything about them that was Native, everything about them that was tribal was stripped from them. And they were kept at these schools for years, for more than a decade, some of them. It was school and education, which meant deculturalization, detribalization, and severe corporal punishment if they didn't obey. The first children who were taken, the first students, were the youngest children of the strongest families in certain nations. They were the youngest children of the strong families who Richard Pratt had not been able to kill. And he was the founder of Carlisle. Carlisle is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was the Carlisle Military Institute, or the Carlisle Industrial Institute. And it processed the Indian children into non-Indian children. And among those children were 5 of my relatives, 5 of my ancestors. On my mother's side are Cheyenne, my mother's Cheyenne grandfather, who was Thunderbird, or Richard Davis, was taken, and he was the youngest son of Bull Bear, who had been the leader of the Cheyenne resistance for many years, as leader of the Dogmen Society, and as a peace chief. And he actually ended up marrying a woman from Carlisle who had also been among the first hostage student class, named Nellie Aspinall, and she was Pawnee. And they had many, many children. The first 3 of them were born at Carlisle, or near Carlisle, at what they call the farmhouse. So they were people who were the epitome of the Carlisle civilized product. There was a picture that Carlisle used to sell of Thunderbird, Nellie Aspinall, and the first 2 children. The first one was my mother's mother, Richenda. And they sold this photo to show that they had made some civilized Indians. And that held until his youngest sister, Thunderbird's youngest sister, died. And she was a student there, the last of their people who was a student there, and she died. And she's buried in the historic graveyard where they moved Native children several times. They buried them, exhumed them, buried them, exhumed them, buried them in this historic cemetery. And you don't know who's where. You just can see some tombstones with their names. And they're fully documented about how they died, why they died, and usually it's of consumption, or bronchitis, or measles, or mumps. These things that were brought from Europe that we had no resistance to, and in some cases still don't. And it was those very diseases that wreaked havoc with Native nations and diminish the populations, sometimes by as much as 95%. The Arikaras were the ones who were almost driven to extinction by just a few of these diseases. And in looking over the kind of disease map, they coincided with the attacks on the southern and northern plains nations by General Sheridan, Philip Sheridan, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and other officers like Colonel Pratt. And they chased Native peoples all over the plains. And they did, they fought in the Red River War when there was a big outbreak in the southern plains, and the Cheyennes and Arapahoes and Kiowas and Comanches all said, and we've had enough of these rancid rations. We're going on the good Buffalo Road. And they went into the Palo Duro Canyon, where there were lots of buffalo. And they ate really well for a short period of time. It was a good outbreak. And they even had a sacrifice prisoners to be taken. They assigned volunteers to be that. And then they had each nation had a procession of leaders so that there was no mistaking who was in charge, who led this, and who was going to do time for it. And Bull Bear was one of those ceremonial leaders. And his son, Thunderbird, was seen by Colonel Pratt and written about by Colonel Pratt as someone who was doing a scalp dance one day and then was at Carlisle another. So he was very happy to have people he had fought and chased. So the people were being chased around and attacked at dawn, and it was a horrible time. And every so often you see the record of disease, of epidemics that were attacking them as well, cholera and measles and mumps and then malaria and so on and so on. And you think, how did the people survive all of that? It really is quite a miracle that any of us are here. A friend of mine, Lois Risling, who's a Hoopa medicine woman and educator, says, we're here because some white man could not kill one of our ancestors. That's why we're here. That's an amazing thing to think of, how narrow that thread is. So, we survived, though, somehow. And every Native nation has a long walk or a massacre or something that is awful from that time that shows that we were treated as non-humans or less than or subhuman. And of course, our religions were not even looked at as religions. They were looked at as something else that subhumans might do. So they're always discussed in terms of rites, R-I-T-E-S. Never rights, R-I-G-H-T-S. GHTS, they're always discussed as mythology rather than history or religious history. As, again, stories rather than histories. They're always less than. And part of that less than construct comes from these civilization regulations, which say that everything is an offense. Everything. Following a medicine man or the instructions of a medicine man who is characterized as being pagan and heathen is an offense. Conducting ceremonies is an offense. And these were punishable by very severe penalties, and they were laid out, either prison or starvation or both, and they were open-ended, and they were discretionary for the federal Indian agent. They could say, well, they can spend more time in the slammer. They can be starved for one more week. So all of this was up to the discretion of the federal Indian agent once they had all of the instructions about what was an offense and what wasn't an offense. So they were criminalizing everything that made Native people Native people. And they provided for Native people to be confined to the reservation, or in some cases, as with the Navajo people, they were providing for concentration in a camp called Bosque Redondo for 10 years, while they were supposed to be moved to Indian Territory. They were never supposed to be in their home within the 4 areas, sacred mountains. They were never supposed to go back there. They were supposed to be removed to Indian Territory. So they were kept at Bosque Redondo for 10 years, and then it was a miracle of negotiation that they negotiated their treaty of 1868 that provided for them to go back home. They had to walk back home. They had walked to Bosque Redondo, and this is 450 miles. And this was in a time when there were some trains, and they would see them go by. So there were harsh conditions, but somehow treaties were made that provided for the security of the people. Now, that wasn't done without some amazing confidence, spiritual confidence that the people had. Jennifer Dennett Dale, who is a writer and educator and curator, and part of our treaties project at the National Museum of the American Indian, which we will have open. It's an exhibit that opens on September 21st of this year, so if anyone's in Washington at that time, it'll be quite a splashy opening, I think. Please come. And we will have a publication out, and she's written about this. She located a document that was in ineffective deposition by 2 medicine men who said and the Navajo medicine men, who said that the 10 years of confinement had exhausted the men's diplomacy, and that the women had to take over for a couple of days during the treaty negotiation, and until the men could be revived and until their diplomacy was no longer exhausted. And then they took over. Throughout Indian life, we have these intriguing glimpses, bolstered by pretty specific oral history about such things. But it's rare on our side to have such documents during this civilization period that tell you a lot about what happened, but really tease you, and you have to go to the people for the oral history. What came down in your family? What came down in your family? And there are huge pieces that are missing because the civilization regulations wiped out whole families, whole medicine people, medicine knowledge, who weren't ready to pass that knowledge along completely to someone else, so it stopped. And in many of our cultures, we have the opposites who take care of us, and we take care of them. And whether it's called winter, summer, or black, white, or red, white, or whatever the construct is in a particular native nation, you knew who your opposite was, and at a time of death, for example, you didn't have to do anything. They took care of everything. They cooked. They took care of all the duties, and that helped you concentrate only on mourning. And you had to do it fast, and you had to do it in secret during these civilization regulation times from the 1880s to the 1930s. Think how long that is. Just think how long that is. So you had to do these things in secret, and if you were caught, all of the things around you for a giveaway, for example, and this is in any kind of ceremony, birth, death, passage of life, marriage, all that material was confiscated and you were put in jail for doing that ceremony. The civilization regulations say, and the defense that one was a mourner is, and the excuse that one was a mourner is no defense under the law. Well, now we can look back and say, what law? Where is this law? It just doesn't exist. There's no such law. It's just what the Secretary of Interior and all of these employees agreed was the law. Congress looked the other way. Everyone looked the other way and just said, well, they're the authority. So, all of these opposites, sometimes your opposite would be just taken out, just destroyed. They would be gone. So think what that does to the culture. Think what that does to the balance of that people have known for ever so long. Now, as with all things that attack human beings, it was really about land and other resources. So that anything outside the reservation, such as a sacred place, was now declared as part of the public domain. And federal agencies just traded these among each other many times, and often they were just sold off to the highest bidder. So that's where we were on religions being whittled away, the population was diminishing. It was a pretty sad circumstance, and you can look at the terminology of the time about vanishing American, and you see the field of archaeology springing up during that late 1800s period, and they were looking to capture the last of the vanishing American. And you see these end-of-the-trail images of the warriors slumped over the horse, and everything was bleak because it really was. And when Hollywood came along, rather than reporting the good news about people surviving, they reported Cheyenne autumn and the end of everything, end of the trail, and the end of this, and the last of Ishi, the last of his tribe. Everything had to be the last of, or the death of the people, or the long walk that we all took. And then some people were just erased from history. It was reported and recorded in a lot of history books that are used to teach American history, that the tribes that were removed during Andrew Jackson's regime were just in the southeast United States, or what was then the southeast. Said nothing about the Pottawatomie. Often they were portrayed as only Cherokee, that only Cherokee had a trail of tears. I mean, I've already discussed the Navajo and their long walk. The Pottawatomie had a walk of death for their removal, their forced removals. The Indian Removal Act actually required a treaty of removal, required in effect the consent of the removed. And even when they did not have that, such as with the Muscogee Creek Nation, no treaty of removal ever happened. So even where they didn't have it, people got removed anyway. The 1851 treaty, which was a pretty good treaty, except for it was about access across the plains lands, and it was with the Cheyennes and Arapahoes and Arikaras and Mandans and Hidatsas and Lakotas and all sorts of peoples. Didn't mention the Poncas, but gave their land, acknowledged that their land should go to the Lakotas, and then once that mistake was discovered, did they try to correct it, the United States? No. What they did was remove the Poncas to Indian Territory, even though they had treaties guaranteeing their security in their homeland. So terrible things were happening during this time that haven't been sorted out yet. Some have. And then in the perception of the American people, there was Andrew Jackson, who was a great, great person, wonderful head of the Democratic Party. And I'll tell you, there are people in Oklahoma. Indian Territory was basically Kansas, Oklahoma now. There are people in Oklahoma today, in Kansas today, Native people, who are staunch Republicans because Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. Long memories. I mean, I get heart palpitations just getting money out of the ATM machine. His face flipping at me over and over again. Why you? But it is worth a pout. So our people were taken, wrenched from their homes and moved at bayonet point and at gunpoint into foreign territory, into Indian territory, guaranteed secure homelands, and then along comes the Dawes Act, which allotted lands all over Indian country, said, well, the individual Indians need land, so let's just chop up the tribal lands, and anything that's left over, we'll say that's for public sale, that's for public consumption. That's where you get the non-Indian people who can make the land runs for the Indian lands, because they're now theirs. And what kind of justice is that? So it was, a horrible time of broken promises, of coerced treaties, of people being erased from history. So removal has come down to just the Cherokees. Whereas you see the Nez Perce, after Chief Joseph, after his band took on the whole army of the United States, and once they were caught, they were removed to Fort Leavenworth. So they lived there, and many died there. And then they were taken back. I mean, the Nez Perce are, from Idaho, basically, that area, Oregon, Idaho. And then they were taken down to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Just think about that geography. And then after a while, they were moved to the Colville Reservation, where they remained, and they couldn't go anyplace, but their children were taken to Carlisle Institution, many of their children, and Chief Joseph, as a warrior who had surrendered, got to go to Carlisle to visit his children. But he had to make a speech with General Howard, the man he had surrendered to. And there's a picture of Howard and Chief Joseph with Pratt in the middle. None of them look very happy. But they gave not dueling, but joint commencement addresses at Howard. How painful that must have been for an opportunity to see the children. But you have the specter of a lot of these chiefs being paraded around the world, around the United States world, at these world fairs. 1904, they were at the St. Louis World's Fair, which was the celebration of the Columbian experience. Geronimo was there. I mean, they were mocking these people who were captives and who were prisoners. Geronimo was never free in his lifetime, even though he was taken around and paraded around. And his people were never free. I used to have a friend who's now gone, who was the head of who was the chairwoman of the Fort Sill Apache tribe, Mildred Cleghorn, and she was born in the 1900s as a prisoner of war. Right there, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And she never got to go in a formal capacity to live in her homeland, which is in New Mexico. So she lived and died in Oklahoma, essentially as a military person who was in the control of the U.S. military. Right now, the Fort Sill Apaches are still trying to reclaim lands in their homeland in Oklahoma. So this has ramifications for our own time, and this is why our parents and our families built those of us who tried to do something about that in federal Indian law. And it isn't that they programmed us or that we said, okay, we're going to do this and then this and then this. It was only in looking back over this expanse of time, we can see that we really were doing things in a strategic way. It was just that we didn't know it all the time. And there were things that had been unplanned. Nonetheless, what we did was to pull up from the veto bait box of the Nixon and Ford administrations the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which is really a policy statement, because there were still hangovers from the civilization regulations, which had been removed as part of the Indian New Deal during the Roosevelt era by people who had worked with native peoples, Taos, Pueblo, other Pueblos, primarily, and had been artists in support, non-native artists in support of native rights to religion and to economic security. and one of them, John Collier, was the Bureau of Indian Affairs commissioner. And so he was a poet. And some of the other people were Georgia O'Keeffe and D.H. Lawrence, and pretty interesting crowd that worked between New Mexico and New York to try to throw off the shackles of the civilization regulations. And they got the opportunity to actually do that when they became the people in charge of things in the Roosevelt administration. So John Collier, working with Felix Cohen, who was the solicitor of the Department of the Interior, got the civilization regulations withdrawn. And then they did something that they thought was a good thing, the Indian Reorganization Act, which recognized Indian cultural rights, Indian self-government, and so forth. And while that had its flaws, the combination of withdrawing the civilization regulations and recognizing tribal rights was so important and a mighty step forward. But the people had internalized these civilization regulations and kept thinking that it was still wrong to have ponies, which were outlawed under them, that it was okay to have pigs because that meant you were a farmer, but not good to have ponies because that meant you were warriors, that you were nomads, that you were non-farmers. And there were some Native people who said, don't speak your language, it's gone. Don't worry about these sacred places, they're gone. Just move on ahead with your life. As a person who doesn't speak your language, as a person who doesn't go to these sacred places, as a person who does not have ceremonies. And in some cases, they were doing it because they thought this was the best way for the survival of the people. And in some cases, they were doing it just because that's what they were taught, and that's what they internalized, either at boarding school or at home. And some of the brightest and wisest people were gone. They had been just removed. So it was a big step that was taken when the civilization regulations were withdrawn. A reporter Rich Leiby at the Washington Post, who's still there, was doing a story about our lawsuit against the Washington football franchise. And I was talking to him about the civilization regulations and that this name had been adopted while the civilization regulations were still in place. And he said, how did they affect your parents? And I said, well, I'm not sure if they even know about the civilization regulations. It's a very narrow area that I seem to be one of the very few in the country pursuing. But they had enormous impact in Indian country. So I said, but call my dad. My mother won't talk to you, but my dad might. So Dad did, and what he said essentially was, well, up until, I can guess the year they were withdrawn, and he was right. that up until that time, when we would be beaten up for speaking our language or saying something that was perceived as tribal, we would be beaten with boards. And after that point, we were beaten with leather straps. And that was a good day. Now, only a person who had been beaten up with boards would think that it was a good thing when you had that change to leather straps. And I asked Dad, what do you mean by boards? He said, well, 1x2s and 2x2s. Well, that started when he was 9 years old at Uchee Indian School, another federal institution, before he went to Chilocco. And it continued there because he continued to run away. And I went to a Uchee Indian School reunion with him at one point when he was in his 70s and other classmates were in their 70s. And they were all laughing like people from survival experiences do, and talking about how funny this was and that was. And they were talking about how funny it was that Dad made the most money for the white bounty hunters of all the Indian students. Well, it was an easy job for them because the Indian students would run away, but they would just run home. So the bounty hunter would go with the buckboard with the cage, a wooden cage, and go to the home of the student, get them, which was the capture, which was them just walking out the door and getting in the cage because they knew the routine. And then they would go back to Uchee Indian School, later Chilocco, and the bounty hunter would be given $5 for that. So they were laughing about how Dad won the most money for these bounty hunters. And it was just an amazing experience to be there and hear that and what it must have been like. And how much they were laughing about it. And that for them, that was their history. That was part of their history. And it was really good that they had been part of a resistance, even if it was just running home. Even if it put $5 in the pocket of the white bounty hunters. Now that's in my lifetime, that's my dad. So this is not something way out of reach. I touched him, my children touched him. So that was their experience. But he was absolutely right about the date of the withdrawal of these civilization regulations. But they hung on. They hung on. So it was important that the United States make a declarative statement that it was the policy of the United States to preserve and protect the native religions. And that's what the American Indian Religious Freedom did. It became an umbrella policy of promise, of protection, to preserve and protect. Whereas the civilization regulations had been committed to doing everything they could to wipe out the Indian religions. So what we've done in our time is to create this policy declaration and then to do the follow-on legislation in all of the areas that were needed. And my concentration has been mostly on creating this National Museum of the American Indian, which we envisioned in 1967, at the same time that we decided to start our coalition and do repatriation law, even though we didn't call it that at that time, and to do the language revitalization legislation, even though we didn't refer to it in those terms at that time. So we've done that, and that's really good. But people shouldn't think that there's nothing else to do, because even though we have protections and our prosecutors have subpoena power and there are great fines that can be levied, there's jail time for people who offend the repatriation laws, all of that's very good, but there's still more. For example, one of the prosecutors said, when you were doing NAGPRA, did you consult with any law enforcement people? I said, no, we were doing policy and trying to close the doors on regulations. And there were a lot of things we were doing, but we didn't pay attention to the enforcement side of it as much as we should have. And Justice said that anything we did in the private area was out of bounds, and that was definitely veto bait. So I had reached into the RICO statutes to find the section of NAGPRA that relates to crossing interstate lines with human remains and making that a specific offense. And that was able to be used to close down a lot of the internet trafficking in human remains and sacred objects, and is still being used because that all is interstate commerce. And that wasn't what I had in mind in doing it, but it's been used in that way, and it can be because it's an act of Congress. It's not just what I had in my mind. So we've been able to construct a lot of remedies in Indian country. What we haven't been able to do is protect sacred places to the extent that we need to. And now we have even some native nations desecrating and attempting to destroy sacred places. The Porch Band of Creeks, for example, in Alabama, who are building a casino on top of a sacred place to the Hickory Ground people of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and there's a big lawsuit about that. And you can read about it in these lawsuits and lots of press coverage. But imagine a native nation. I mean, and when we were doing our repatriation laws, we didn't contemplate that it would be native people who would be desecrating our sacred place in the name of tribal sovereignty. And I'm one of the main proponents of tribal sovereignty and constructing things so that there is sovereignty involved and controlling in a lot of areas. But this, we do it because we're sovereign, doesn't work when you're talking about desecration of a place that you have been pledged to preserve. So we have problems of these kind that are cropping up that we never thought of and that we need to think of. I thank you for coming here and for being so attentive. And I want to, there was a request to open this for question and answer, and I may have, since I've gone on for so long, may have answered a lot of questions you may have come here with. But nonetheless, I will close my portion of this and leave it open to you to ask your question or to make your comment about anything I may have said. And if I inadvertently offended anyone, I didn't mean to. My friend Bob Houses, who's Chiricahua Apache, always, great sculptor, always says, I'm talking about the historic white man, and if you're behaving like the historic white man, then you should be offended. But if you're not behaving like the historic white man, you get a pass. So, thank you for coming and listening and staying. Sure.
Powerful and moving and disturbing conversation. We do have a little time for questions, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not at all.
So if you have a question, just please raise your hand, and a microphone will find its way to you by some strange process. Right in the middle there.
Thank you very much. I think about my perspective as an 8th grade English teacher, so I have like 100 13-year-olds, and from time to time the topic of American Indian rights and sovereignty, religious traditions come up. One, I'm flabbergasted by the lack of knowledge. So the other day a student asked me, wait, there are nations within nations? And she was so indignant about the possibility that it was difficult for me, having had honest and open conversations with people knowledgeable about this, to find an entry point for this conversation. But religion might be one of those entry points, and I was thinking about something I think Vine Deloria said about Western religion being fundamentally material in nature, like you can knock a church down and rebuild it somewhere else, and it's still a church and it's still sacred in that way. But American Indian religious traditions are, I don't want to characterize it with an adjective that I'm not prepared to do, but not material in that way. So my question would be, how do you use or explain the difference between Western and indigenous religious traditions in a way that makes sense to young people and gives them an entry point to this conversation?
Oh, there's no difference, actually. They're the same. The problem comes in a misunderstanding that we are like the Irish Americans rather than like Ireland. So this is our homeland. These are our countries. So we're France. We're not the French Americans. So that's the difference. The people who have come here are a movable feast. I mean, so they move things around. They're not in their homeland. They're attached to their homeland, but in a different way than we are. We're trying to just maintain in our homes, in our countries. So that's the main difference. but when you come right down to it, we're the Vatican, or but our places are not respected. In some cases, we've been able to protect our places. There are great protection agreements. In some cases, land has been turned over to our people, just flat out turned over. In some cases, you have these protection agreements like Coche de Pueblo has with the BLM. They can close Cachacatue, Tent Rocks National Monument, for ceremonies, and they can close it to the public immediately. It doesn't have to be announced beforehand. And the reason is the Pueblo had to close it. That's the reason. They don't delve into it. They don't have to tell anyone anything. So you have a non-disclosure part of it. That's really important. In these kind of protection agreements. So people are really trying to focus on what works and how we can construct protections that don't make up for time lost or things done to us, but that the people who are the most immediately involved, whose religion it is, can go from here forward with with enough protection that they feel satisfied, that they feel is dignified, that they feel works for their ceremonies, for their religion today. So this is being done here and there. So there are people who are non-native who are really trying to focus on this and trying to make it work. And good and true people like John Collier and Felix Cohen and others before them who really tried to do good things, but oftentimes it didn't work out. The people who created the federal Indian boarding schools were the people who were trying to do the better thing. That was the good alternative to extinction. So, at each allotment was the alternative to continued encroachment by non-natives, and so on. So there's no difference. It's just that we aren't seen in our proper perspective.
Question over here.
Hello?
I'm sorry, it's so late.
Oh.
I came from Cape Cod,
Oh.
Mashpee, Wampanoag, Ramona,
Yeah,
and
of course, thank you.
yes, I want to give you a
Oh.
few things too. Welcome you to our territory. I'm so sorry you're late. And I underestimate the traffic of Boston every time. That's good. But welcome. It's a hard story. And I respect and honored to hear the way that you present it. It's important.
Thanks so much. Yeah, just time for one more question. Thanks.
Hi, Hi, my name's Slava Shah. I'm actually an intern at the Native American program. I just had a question about, you talked about how your ancestors were ripped of their culture and religion.
I can't hear
Can
you.
I'm
speak
sorry.
up a
I'm
little?
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. You talked about how your ancestors were ripped of their religion and their culture. And once you learned that, I'm pretty sure it was really difficult to take all that in and grow with it and fight for everything. I know that your family told you that it was going to be hard, but what was basically the most difficult part of your journey? And did you
Well,
ever think...
I'm sorry, I still can't hear you clearly.
let me go up there.
Okay,
Okay. I'll just go up
please,
there.
yes.
Sorry.
Thank you for doing this.
No,
Sorry.
I should have done that earlier.
Okay.
I think you should still take the microphone, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah, so, yeah,
Hello.
if you put the microphone up,
okay,
yeah, that would be
sorry.
great. Thanks.
I'm not used to using microphones, you guys. I wanted to know, when your parents first told you about your history and how your ancestors were ripped of their culture and their religion, I'm pretty sure as a child it was very difficult to hear. Just hearing that, and it's hard, and to take the journey to fight for those rights. I know that you said that your parents and your uncles and aunts and your family told you that it was going to be hard as well, and taught you how to go into meetings. But I wanted to know, like, going into it, did you find that it was a lot more difficult than you had intended? And what was the hardest part of all of that, like the difficult trials that you personally went through? And given all of that, did you ever think you were going to get this far? Because you accomplished a lot, and it's very admirable.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That was, well, you don't learn what you learn all of a sudden. Knowledge isn't just dumped on you, or information. And it's not in one setting, and it's not, it's just a life work. And then at some point, you're educating your elders who didn't know some things, and you're helping them understand what you've learned from other people, from other nations, from research, and from digging in and finding things and really understanding things. So it happily, it is a process, and you get information when you need it. One time my father said something that was really profound, which I won't repeat. It's a private thing, but I said, "Dad, you've never told me that." And he said, "Well, we haven't gone fishing in a long time." So that's how it is, and I was fully an adult. So I went home and went fishing. And we just talked, and some of it is just about the trout, and some of it is just about common things, and then some buried in there is a nugget of information about what happened. I have a friend, Roger Buffalohead, who's Ponca, an educator, who said it's as if a blanket were thrown on all our peoples, and we're just now peeking out and able to see more than we were able to see with this blanket on us. And that it's a good thing that we don't learn all of this at one time when we're too young to do anything about it, or to understand that we can do something about it, or to even envision that. And well, honest. I have to be honest. What he said was, following that was, if we learned it all at once, we would hate the white man forever. I told this to my mother, who said, "Who says we don't?" And this is my mother, who was a good girl in boarding school, who was very careful and never did anything to upset anyone. So her saying that kind of thing was very strong. And something that you have to fold in, that's her experience, that's what led, all of her experience led her to say that. So you have to wonder if I even knew what her experience was. So I love the Roger Buffalo Head's idea of a blanket being put over all our peoples, and that we're just now looking out. We're starting with my generation, we're sort of the luxury generation. We had the ability, the time to do these things. People made time and made a place for us to coordinate activities, to think broadly and think how we might work together toward a certain goal and achieve that goal. My tribal people used to have a business committee, now we have a legislature, and when the business committee was running, they had a program for a while where they would take Indian youth to Washington. So when I was in high school, they selected me and then a boy who was Arapaho, and we went to Washington, and I learned a lot on that trip. First of all, we met with Robert Kennedy. I mean, that was unheard of, to meet with the Attorney General at that time, and it was a really important meeting. We didn't get anything done, but he understood what we wanted. Our Fort Reno lands back, which we're still working toward and not getting, because they are on top of the Anadarko oil basin, which is the richest one in North America. So we went to Washington, and we were told to be the translators. And we looked at each other because I only spoke conversational Cheyenne and no Arapaho, and he spoke ceremonial Arapaho and no Cheyenne. And we were not Cheyenne and Arapaho, we were Cheyenne and Arapaho. And the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma, while combined and have been for a long time and wanted to be, are mostly Cheyenne and Arapaho, which is interesting. So they said we would be the translators, and we said, how are we going to do that? Plus, some of the business committee members spoke no Cheyenne or Arapaho. We said, what are we translating? They said, you're not translating anything. You're giving us time to think, because people in Washington talk really fast. So that was one thing. And that was an important lesson. Just take time to breathe. If your side wants something, you don't have to get into the rhythm and the pace of the other side. You can call for a timeout. You can call a recess. You can just change everything about the meeting So that was an important lesson. And when we got back, or I'm sorry, before we left, they were asked by my uncle, "Why do you want her to go?" And they said, "Well, because she talks good and she ain't afraid of nobody." So those became resume items. Talks good, ain't afraid of nobody. So those, I mean, that's a real bolstering message, right? So along with the bad news, we were getting a lot of reinforcement and support and lessons and accumulating generational knowledge. That's a great thing about ancient cultures is we get a lot of stuff right. And you just have that building you like an armadillo as you are accumulating the bad news. So that's why we can survive, right? That's why we can do things, because we have the good messages, the wisdom of generations. So when you say things, it's not really you saying them. It's all your ancestors you've called into the room. It's all the people you've met with. You say, wow, that is a wonderful way to put that. It changes, it morphs, and sometimes it becomes federal Indian law.
Suzanne, Harjo, you talk good and you ain't afraid of nobody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.